for that, because it's really a wonderful corrective. Because in St. Augustine, more than most places, we deal with the past, and the past influences the present, and the past is a big part of our present economy. And I remember when Mike was talking that back for the 400th birthday of the city back in 1965, one of the big projects they did was they got the Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright Paul Green to write what became Florida's official state play, Cross and Sword. And of course, this was exactly at the same time as the Civil Rights Movement, and you can't separate the two. Dr. Earl Newton, who was the head of the restoration program, went on national television on the Today Show to criticize Mrs. Peabody for raising the question of civil rights. This to him was not an important thing at all. And he wrote to Latin American governments and said, this is small potatoes. The real thing about St. Augustine is this Spanish colonial history. So a letter was sent to Paul Green, and Paul Green was a man who was known to be sympathetic to civil rights. He had collaborated with Richard Wright and Zora Neale Hurston on projects over the years. And the letter was saying, why have you written this play that's going to be all white? And I had read the background documents on it. She got a very smarmy letter back saying, race has nothing to do with it. There simply were no Negroes in St. Augustine between 1565 and 1567. Michael will tell you that that's not true, but that's how politics and current events influences the past and our perception of the past. In the years when I worked at Government House, I went through all the files there, and another of the big projects for the 400th birthday was the St. George Street, the transformation of it from a downtown Main Street with Sears Roebuck and Western Auto to the current tourist trap that you see today with fake Spanish colonial buildings and anything your heart could desire in the way of t-shirts and rubber alligators. But, they dealt with it property by property by property, and I remember there was a file in there, because Spanish Street, which runs parallel to St. George Street, was a largely black, historically residential neighborhood. And the file for Spanish Street was labeled, Slum Properties to be Removed. And Sandra Parks, my friend, tells me, almost overnight, the entire black neighborhood was eliminated. And I think if you go back to earlier preservation efforts in the 1930s, you'll find the same kind of a file there. So, it's never been dispassionate history. It's always been a history under the direction of the leading figures in the community, and their attitudes get reflected in this history. I was telling some people on the tour today that the 2 bits of instruction I was given when I was hired to do the survey back in the 1970s was, don't waste any time in Lincolnville. There's no history down there. And you must never mention the name of Martin Luther King in St. Augustine. Now, let me tell you, as a historian, the greatest pleasure of living in St. Augustine is that you can walk down the street and walk past people like Purcell Conway, who can tell you firsthand what it was like to be out in the water there at St. Augustine Beach in the summer of 1965. This is a historian's dream. Michael would have to have a time machine to do that, to go back to those people. And yet here we can do it. And yet when you come to the actual, our local bureaucrats of history, this kind of gets swept aside. As I was told, that's not real history. That's not real history. Well, it is, and time is moving on, and although we have some amazing people like Mrs. Rena Ayers, who lived to be 109, you can't count on it for everyone. Those people who were youngsters then are now getting Social Security and Medicare. Those who were adults then are now in their 90s. Those who were senior citizens are now, with the passing of Mrs. Ayers, all gone. And if we don't squeeze the ones who remain like a lemon, so we have that first-hand information, it will never get saved for the future. I learned very early on, I had an office in Government House that was kind of a passageway between other areas. So everybody else in the building ran through there, and you could hear snatches of conversation. And I remember how brutal the archaeologists were towards every archaeologist who had ever gone before them, because it's inherent in archaeology that you destroy the evidence by digging it. If you dig it and do a bad job, nobody gets to come and dig it again because it's gone, it's disturbed, it's destroyed forever. And I sat there for a while and I said, they are so harsh on their predecessors. what do they think their successors are going to say about them? Their successors get a new theory of what's important to get out of this. So from that time on, I always said, part of my time as a historian is looking at the past, but part of my time is looking at the future and saying, what is the me of 50 years from now going to look back and say, why didn't that idiot say this? Why didn't they say that? I've never heard anybody get criticized for saving too much. It's always for what you lose, for what you don't save, for what you let go. So, having said that, let me tell you that I want to share with you the pleasure of hearing somebody who grew up here and was here in those times and whom I always enjoy listening to. So let me pass it on to Purcell Conway. I'm history at second hand. Purcell Conway is a historic figure himself.
Good evening. I didn't expect this. I thought this was going to be, I guess, a round table discussion, not only, I guess, interacting with the group with some history. But I will give you my feelings and perspectives as a teen. Growing up in segregated St. Augustine as a child, it's very hard. I'm a man now, 66 years old. I have to say honestly, I'm saddened and angered at my age. As a 10-year-old selling newspapers in front of the fort here, I had the slightest idea what segregation was, what racism was. I was a child of 10 trying to sell papers. I did pretty good, very good. I did better than most of the white paper boys at the St. Augustine Way. And that fort was a gold mine. But I used to always have two white people boys following me around. They didn't catch me. I was pretty good on my bike. But I got tired of losing just to get to the fort. So it's a big deal. So they followed me up here one day. They took positions to my left and right. And as the tourists came out of the fort, they would stop and look. Look at me, two white people. All of a sudden, they stopped buying papers from me. As a 10-year-old, what is going on? I just couldn't figure out what was going on. I sat on the curb at the fort for hours trying to figure out what had happened, or what is happening. And my great-grandmother who raised me, she always told me you're handsome. So that was the problem. I'm looking at one paper boy, he's white, blonde hair, blue eyes. I said, this guy, no, I'm handsome. The other guy was dark hair. So I'm trying to think as a 10-year-old, wait a minute. Can't be looks. I see, all right, my shirt is clean, my pants are clean, my bike is shiny. I couldn't figure out what was going on for the life of me. Now, as I matured into high school, I started seeing a different form of realization of what was racism. My mother would come downtown at the shop while people she knew, particularly white folk. She was always Julia. Julia this, Julia that. And she would reply, Mrs. So-and-so or Mr. So-and-so. So I used to say, Mom, what is with this? You call them by Mr. and Mrs. and they call you by Julia. What's going on? Oh, I didn't even know. Couldn't figure it out. But as time progressed, trying to keep a buck in my pocket, what little menial jobs I could find, just to maintain. I'm pretty much like I said, I'm in a high school. And trying to find anything of substance was impossible for a black child. I used to argue with the teachers at Murray High. Why, when you give me a book to start my school year, it's always either written in or 4 or 5 years old? Oh, leave it alone. I was told, stop being a fuss. Fortunately for me, my uncle would move north to New York, left a small library. And this is where I got my education, because the high school was not providing what you would call a decent education to the black students. And I couldn't fault the teachers, because again, if you spoke up, you were taught. I have to give thanks to the college students of Florida Memorial College. They had a small organization that would tutor a number of kids from Murray High. They informed us about demonstrations nationally. They told us about how we could participate in trying to build a better future for ourselves. They offered their swimming pool to the youth, the black youth of St. Augustine, during the summer. We didn't have a pool. So, between their tutelage and our desire for change, this is where a lot of the activity around civil rights started. I think if you look at any footage, film footage, of the early start of the civil rights movement, what are you going to see? A bunch of young kids. You don't see too many adults at that time, but what you will see again is young folk. My personal problem was I just felt despair. There was nothing offered as far as employment, any decent employment for black youth in St. Augustine, and I think in most of the other counties and cities around Florida. You could wash pots, mop floors, short of cooks. When it came of anything of substance, it wasn't there. And this is where my anger comes in. I look at my white brothers and sisters out there, and you look at the days, events, now, particularly here in St. Augustine, it's gotten worse. And I still make this point. From city government to county government to federal government, when you look at the disparity of employment among minority candidates, it's sad. It's ridiculous. You can't justify such numbers. Now, I met my wife in Daytona, 19 years old. She's from New York. We married, we went back to New York. And this is shortly after the passage of the Civil Rights Act. 2 years passed. What I did find there was ample opportunity. You took a test, you passed the test, you got a job. Even with that, even in the North, my wife and I both passed the test and went to the post office. And that was the mecca. Jobs like that was the start of black middle class across the nation.